Okay. Hi, today is Wednesday, June 24th, 2020. I am Katie Weber, and today I am interviewing Rabbi David Segal for the Houston Jewish History Archive. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Uh, Thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, thanks for
Um,
doing this. A good excuse to refresh my family history
Good.
a bit as well.
Uh, well, let's start there. Can you tell me a little bit about your family and how your family came to Houston?
Yes, so it was on my mom's side. My mom was born in Houston, but her parents were both born in Poland, different parts of Poland, and we do have somewhere archives on exactly which shtetls they grew up in. But they came before World War II as children with their families. And my grandmother, Judy, lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My grandfather, Eddie, called him Papa, he came at the age of 8 in 1921. And he had a couple sisters who were already living here in Cleveland, so he stayed with them. He was the youngest by far of, I think it was like 6 siblings, and it was a big family. And he was kind of raised by his sisters as older siblings. His mother died when he was a teenager. His father returned to Poland. I don't have all the details on why or what
Mm-hmm.
happened with that, but I did think it's interesting. He graduated high school in 1932 in Cleveland, and he received a scholarship to go to Harvard, but he still couldn't afford it, and he instead went to Ohio State in Columbus, and he had a job teaching bar mitzvah classes to put himself through school to help support him. That became a theme later on. In 1936, he went to Cambridge, Massachusetts with a college friend, Ohio State friend, Harry Rosen, whose wife, Shifra, was a cousin of Judith Shevach, who became my grandmother. So Eddie and Judy met in that trip, but Eddie went back to Ohio to graduate, and then he returned to Boston area following that. What I'm a little less clear on is why they moved to Buffalo, New York after that
Mm-hmm.
fall. I think it's because he was able to find a job teaching Hebrew, honestly. It was at Rabbi Adler's congregation. I don't have a name for it, but whatever it was at the time in Buffalo. And he also at the time decided to apply to veterinary school. The story we tells that he actually wanted to be a doctor, but he just couldn't afford medical school, and so veterinary school seemed to be an option. He applied to Texas A&M, and that's what brought them to Texas. So he began there in 1937. My grandmother was still in Buffalo, where she had a job. But in the first year of school, my grandfather had a car accident. So my grandmother quit her job and moved from Buffalo to College Station to help take care of him. And then she moved to Houston after that because she couldn't get a job in College Station. She taught, this is like a little wandering through Houston Jewish history. She taught Hebrew at a number of places in those years. This is like late 30s. At Beth El for Rabbi Blumenthal, which was Crawford and Walker at the time. And um, my grandfather went on the weekends to teach at Beth Israel, which was then on Holman Street. And that was when Rabbi Khan was there before he went to the war and before Emmanuel started and hired him. And I learned my grandfather also did conduct services for Hillel at Texas A&M. So they both were teaching Hebrew on the side to support themselves and get him through school and all of that. My mother was born in 1943 in Houston, and then she went to Bel Air High School and went to Sophie Newcomb College of Tulane University. It was definitely a separate women's college at the time. Graduated in 1965. She was visiting a college friend in Norfolk, Virginia, where she met my dad, similar to how her parents met, I guess. And they, let's see, they got married in 1965, I guess soon after she graduated. Rabbi Khan did the wedding at the Shamrock Hotel, which no longer exists. And then they moved to Washington, D.C. for 3 years. She got a master's in audiology from Gallaudet College, and then they returned to Houston in 1968, where my dad entered University of Houston Law School, and my mom was working as an audiologist at Methodist Hospital. And they lived in the Nob Hill apartments, which are still there on Braeswood, not far from Beth Israel. And then a couple years after that, they bought a house in West University, which is where I grew up. And they still live in that house.
Wonderful. So that's how everyone ended up in Houston.
Yes, and stayed after that.
Mm-hmm. And so you were born in Houston. You grew up in Houston, in West U. Can you tell me, what do you remember about growing up here?
I would say I had a nice childhood. I lived in something of a bubble, both geographically and otherwise. I went to Schleicher School for preschool, which is at Beth Israel, and then I went to St. John's from kindergarten through 12th grade, a lifer, as we call it. And my sister is 7 years older. She also went to St. John's. She started in first grade. One of the reasons I got in for kindergarten is because I had a sibling there at the time. So got a little bump up for that, bumped up the list. Sometimes people think it's maybe strange that not just being Jewish at St. John's, but a rabbi of all things who went to St. John's School of all places. There are actually 4 rabbis among the alumni of St. John's now. Interesting trivia. And I would say it's a loosely Christian school, at least it was when I was there. And we had a weekly chapel service that was in the church next door. It was based on Episcopalian liturgy, but fairly ecumenical. We had our own hymnal that was like some of the hymns where you can see where it was whited out to take out words like Christian and Jesus to make it a little more inclusive. But like we did the Lord's Prayer every week, and it was just understood that the Jewish students and the atheists or whoever didn't want to participate in the Lord's Prayer would just sit politely and quietly while the other students did the full on, like there was a kneeling rest. They would kneel and recite the prayer, which I now know forward and backward because I heard it every week for like 13 years. And yeah, I think it had something to definitely shape my Jewish identity because I was often in the role of teaching others about being Jewish. In elementary school, I was a kid who so I was often in the role of teaching my classmates about being Jewish because there weren't that many Jews in the school, and that definitely shaped my Jewish identity as one who cares about it, loves that part of my identity, loves being Jewish, and in a way, it kind of cultivated a sense of being special because there weren't very many of us, and we like made time for it around Jewish holidays. I would bring in a book about Hanukkah or Passover or whatever, and we'd talk about that. So I felt included in that way, or welcomed, I guess I would say in that way. Even though it was sort of like culturally Christian, in the same way that America is culturally Christian, in a sort of dominant cultural sense, the school was too. But it's not a religious curriculum, right? So we didn't have like religious instruction, or it's not really affiliated with the church. It just is on the property next door, and we had a partnership with it. But that was sort of the extent of it.
And what's your relationship like with St. John's now as an alumna?
I am involved in a few ways. One, I've become friendly with the director of spiritual life, which is a new position that did not exist when I was there. I was on the Chapel Guild, which is a student group that helped plan the weekly chapels. And but now they have a position who helps direct that for all lower, middle, and high school, and who teaches classes on religion in the high school. And he asked me to be on a chapel oversight committee, which includes some faculty, parents, alums, and that's kind of a group that helps him think through what to include in chapel in a given year, how to make sure it's kind of broad and inclusive, and so that's a role I like to have. And I go in and teach in his comparative religion class most semesters to well, not when we're on lockdown exactly, but when to talk about Judaism when they get to that point in their class. And I love to do that. I love the questions that the students ask, and it's kind of fun to be back there in a teaching role as well.
That's very cool. And so you grew up going to school at St. John's. Where was your congregation? Well, no, you go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so I went to school at St. John's, and we were very involved in Congregation Emanu. My parents had been married by Rabbi Khan, so they were very connected there. My grandmother, like I said, had taught Hebrew multiple places, but ended up kind of landing there for the longer term. And the story is that she taught Hebrew to Theba Feldman, who I'm told was the first bat mitzvah in Houston. I can't necessarily verify that with historical records, but that's what I've been told.
And do you know when that would have been approximately?
I don't know. Theba is a little older than my parents. So if my mom was born in 43, she must have been born in the 30s. She's told me stories about remembering 1948 when the state of Israel was declared independent, and she remembers dancing in the driveway with friends, like Israeli dancing. We were still friendly with Theba and her family. But I don't know what year that was, but we could find that out. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Congregation Emanu throughout. You know, it was like my dad was on various committees, and I went all the way through high school graduation there. And I was an assistant teacher in the Sunday school when I was in high school, mostly for a second grade class. And I also went to Echo Hill Ranch, another kind of angle on the Jewish upbringing in Texas. And I was a second generation camper there. My mom had gone as a child in the 40s and 50s. This was a camp started by Tom and Minnie Friedman, sort of like these Jewish camping pioneers. It was, and at the time, Jews weren't allowed at other camps. So this was a kind of de facto Jewish camp. By the time I went there were certainly a handful of non-Jewish kids. And it was still sort of Jewish by default, but we didn't have a lot of Jewish content. Like the songs we sang every meal, not much in the way of Jewish, not much Hebrew. But you know, there's a little sort of Shabbat-ish thing we would gesture at on Friday night. But then Sunday morning was like, we would dress in all white, do the flag raising, and then go have barbecue and watermelon. And that was our Texas ritual. And Kinky Friedman was the son of the founders. He lived in a trailer on the camp and smoked cigars and would like play music at camp events, just hanging out, which was kind of a fun side benefit. He is still a character and was then as well.
Yes, so a very Texan experience with a little bit of Jewish thrown in for.
Yes, I think that's a good way to describe it. Yes.
Okay. And so you grew up at St. John's and Emanu and Echo Hill Ranch. When did you decide to become a rabbi? How did that come about and take root from all of this?
I used to be, when I was a kid, people would tell me I should think about being a rabbi. Mm-hmm. And my joke is that it was because I paid attention in Hebrew school and they didn't know what else to tell me. And that's partly because I was just always this kind of studious intellectual kid who liked classroom learning. And but I'm not the kind of person who always knew I wanted to be a rabbi. That's definitely, I don't have rabbis in my family lineage, although we have Hebrew teachers and people who are connected to synagogue and Jewish life. And I actually learned later, after my grandmother Judy had passed away, my mom told me that when I was a kid, at some point, Judy said to my mom, if David wants to be a rabbi, you let him do it. Don't get in his way. Just like, so she must have seen something in me, which is kind of a beautiful story when my mom told me later on. It was really senior year of college that I started thinking about it seriously. And I knew I wasn't ready to go into anything school-wise right after graduation, but I was thinking, do I want to go get a PhD? I'd studied classics and religion and ancient Judaism in particular and ancient Greek philosophy. And I really credit the Jewish Studies department at Princeton where I was that inspired me to like take Jewish intellectual history very seriously. It was the first time I'd really studied Jewish philosophers and Jewish texts in a serious way. It just kind of blew open this whole world of questions and thinkers for me. And so the idea of being a rabbi was intriguing because it was kind of a combination of scholar and community involvement and teaching, all kind of wrapped up into one. And that's ultimately what drew me and still, draws me into it. I did meet with Rabbi Walter, who was my childhood rabbi, forever at Emmanuel. I met with him, I think it was winter break of my senior year of college, because I was thinking seriously, I want to sit down with him and talk about what it means. And I remember waiting in his sort of anteroom before his study, and the door was open, and I heard he was on a call, but he sort of motioned me inside. And he was finishing a phone call where he was saying sort of firmly to someone, I will make this right every way I can. Please don't blame me for something that I didn't cause, but I'm here to fix it. And he hung up the phone and he looked at me and said, do you still want to be a rabbi? And it was an awful situation. It was a bereaved parent who the funeral home had messed something up, but of course she was taking it out on the rabbi, and that's sometimes the role of the rabbi, is to just let people be angry at you. But he was, my first kind of image of a rabbi, because he was the one I knew, and very respected in the community, was a community leader, was very involved in interfaith ministries here. So I had that picture in mind. I went to work at the Religious Action Center after college because I wasn't ready to go right into school. And that's the Reform Movement's social justice hub in Washington, D.C. And there I met two more kind of role models that kind of expanded my vision of what a rabbi could be. One was Rabbi David Saperstein, who was the director of it, also a lawyer, strong background in church-state separation. That's one of his areas of expertise, First Amendment, but also a whole range of other issues that he would advocate on, kind of our man in Washington in a way. And the other rabbi I met was Michael Signer, now of blessed memory, who I worked with on what was called the Commission on Interreligious Affairs of Reform Judaism, kind of cumbersome name, but this was the group that guided the Reform movement's interaction with Christian denominations at the time. It's now expanded to Muslim and other religious groups, but at the time we were very focused on Jewish-Christian dialogue. And Rabbi Signer had taught at HUC, Hebrew Union College, the LA campus, for many years. And when I met him, he was the chair of Jewish Studies and Medieval Studies. I think that's the right title, you have to look it up, but at Notre Dame University, which was a fascinating place as a rabbi, PhD, and he loved it. He just was like, just sort of gleeful about being the rabbi at the Catholic University. And they loved him, and his wife helped run the Holocaust Center. I think that was her job. And he just loved teaching Catholic students and teaching them about medieval church history, medieval Jewish history. Because I had majored in classics, this is another thing that gave him a lot of glee. He would sometimes email me in Latin, which my Latin had become a bit rusty by that point, but it's still fun to engage in that way. But just those two gave me models of what it could mean to be a scholar, rabbi, community activist in their own way. He was Michael Signer was deeply devoted to building bridges between Jews and Christians, and particularly Jewish Catholic dialogue was his in his wheelhouse, but more broadly as well. And he died, unfortunately, in his 50s, pancreas cancer, which is a big loss for our movement and for me as a mentor, but definitely one of my role models and inspirations. Continues to guide me.
It's interesting. I feel like this like Christian Jewish interfaith dialogue keeps coming up again and again. So you worked for 2 years with the Religious Action Center in DC and then went to rabbinical school?
So it was my second year there when I was just working on interfaith dialogue. It was a busy year because The Passion of the Christ came out, and there was So The Passion of the Christ had come out and was it was a lot of tension around that between Jews and Christians because of how it portrayed Jews as villains in the punishment and death of Jesus. And also that year, John Paul II died, the Pope died, and he had been kind of a revelation in terms of the Church-Israel relationship and Church-Jewish community. So it felt like a big loss to the Jewish community that this partner had passed away, and so there was a lot to do in that term. And then so it was from there that I decided, based on the role models that I met and the thinking I'd done about, like I said before, about some kind of combining of scholarship and community activism or involvement and teaching. And I decided to apply to HJHA, and so I went from there to Jerusalem, and first year in Jerusalem, and then 4 years in New York City at the New York campus. And then after that, when I was ordained, so I met my wife also in Jerusalem. She is a Cantor, so we were in school together, and we went together to become the Rabbi Cantor of a small congregation in Aspen, Colorado for 7 years. And then we moved here to Houston 3 years ago, 2017, June. So it was just about exactly 3 years ago.
Wow. And what brought you back to Houston?
Combination of things. We got to a point in Aspen where it was great. We loved the situation. We loved being there. And we had 2 children at that point, 2 young children, and we're starting to feel the distance from family. It's a fairly isolated place. It's expensive and kind of harder to get to. So we're thinking, well, if something comes up in Houston or Boston, where our families are, maybe New York, where my wife's brother and his wife are, we would look at it seriously. And I was also at a point where I was ready to not be in a pulpit rabbinate role anymore. I mean, when I went to rabbinic school, the pulpit rabbinate was not what I envisioned for myself, actually. More like what I saw Rabbi Saperstein and Rabbi Signer doing, what I'm doing now. And so the cantorial position opened up at Emmanuel right around when we started thinking about this. And so my wife interviewed for it, just kind of coincidence that it's the synagogue where I grew up. And it worked also nicely because my family is still here, my sister and her husband and their 2 kids. So to have the cousins around and the family support has been really nice. That was one of the factors. And to be in a bigger city, honestly, with a bigger Jewish community, there's a pull there as well. Be out of a small town, as beautiful and breathtaking a place as Aspen is. We'll still visit. We actually had a plan to visit over spring break, but that's right when the shutdown happened. So we canceled it like a week before we were supposed to go. But we'll be back. And so when we confirmed that my wife was going to be taking this job, I started asking around and talking to mentors and people I'd met through the RAC. And by this point, David Saperstein had stepped down from directorship, and Rabbi Jonah Pesner had come on board as the director in DC. And I'd known him from some training while I was in rabbinic school, and I learned about community organizing through him. And there was this new initiative to launch state projects of the RAC, where instead of just Washington-focused advocacy, we'd be doing grassroots organizing and advocacy at the city and state level in a number of states. And Texas was on the radar. They just didn't have an organizer to do it. And here I came headed to Houston and had the background. So it worked out. The timing was really good. I started at that part-time a week before Hurricane Harvey hit, actually. And that was very complicated, of course, devastating for the Houston-based work we were trying to do. I mean, to set back whatever other agenda we might have had then, and everything was focused on rebuilding and flood relief and flood mitigation. One of the interesting things that did in Houston also was it kind of forced the synagogues and the Jewish institutions to get political, when many of them, I think, would prefer to avoid politics as however you might define that. But it turned out when you don't have a seat at the table where community decisions get made, and they're getting made about things that directly affect your functioning and the question of whether you're going to flood again potentially, you realize you need to have a seat at that table. So I think it pushed a number of the Jewish institutions out of their comfort zone. And actually, coming out of that, the Federation hired a government affairs director, I think because initially really just to manage the flood relief portfolio, but because it was a kind of an acknowledgement that they didn't have a person just cultivating and managing those relationships with city and county officials, which are so vital. So I was also doing work, especially in Austin, San Antonio, Dallas. It then became a big year for the immigration crisis at the border. So I went to McAllen and El Paso, the congregations there doing amazing humanitarian work at the border. That was a big focus for a while. We took a group of about 50 leaders to Austin. Last legislative session, that was 2019 in March. So a year ago plus, and lobbied our legislators on the big school finance reform budget that was like almost $6 billion new funding into public schools in Texas. And that was an exciting show. That was our first ever statewide lobby day in Austin. And more recently, we had a group of rabbis go with a group of immigrant rights leaders to the Harris County Commissioners meeting. That's the county that encompasses Houston, to testify in favor of the county creating a fund, a legal defense fund for immigrants in immigration proceedings, separate from criminal court. It's a whole separate system. And there's no guarantee constitutionally for legal counsel. So other counties in Texas have this, other counties around the country have the millions of dollars allocated for this, but Houston, Harris have nothing. So this was the first vote, which did pass 3-2. And we were proud to have 4 rabbis testify alongside 24 immigrant rights leaders in favor of this fund. It's now in a planning process and will come back up for a final vote, which will mean also budget allocation, which is going to be challenging given pandemic and everything else they're trying to fund. But that should be around mid-August, I've been told. So we're going to see what they need in terms of, rabbinic or other clergy support, actually. So that will be our next fight on that front. And we're also working on election protection and voter engagement. So that's a big deal right now in 2020. We actually got about 40 leaders around the state to do meetings with election officials in the 8 biggest counties in Texas, which encompasses about 54% of the state population, just in those 8 counties. And we met mostly with election administrators, occasionally with the county clerk. And first, it's just getting to know them. What are the challenges to having a safe and accessible election, given pandemic, especially, and shutdown and social distancing, and how do you even run an election right now, and the voting by mail challenges, and there's all kinds of legal cases around that right now. So it's a really complicated fight. We are encouraging our congregations to tell everyone 65 and older to vote by mail because they're automatically eligible, and everyone else to vote early and take the strain off election day. Those are kind of the basics of it. Mm-hmm. And that may lead us to work on voting reform in the legislative section next year, which would be kind of a natural outgrowth of it. And we're in relationship with a big coalition, Texas Voter Protection Coalition. We work with the Texas Civil Rights Project a lot. They're our main organizational partner, but it's also League of Women Voters and ACLU and a number of other advocacy and legal groups all engaged in expanding the accessibility of voting to eligible voters, to put it that way, and combating voter suppression as well.
Wonderful. So a lot of different projects, from education to immigration and voter suppression and voter rights, like,
Yes.
and with different coalitions and organizations. So in a variety of tactics, it sounds like that's just a lot.
Yeah, one of the other things we do is training and coaching for congregations, because the grassroots or relational organizing model involves empowering congregational leaders to build a team within their congregation who can then partner with other organizations in their local community on campaigns towards social change. So built around a coalition-based model that involves identifying and training leaders within your congregation and building deeper relationships among them. So it's time intensive, but it pays off down the road.
And so you work all across Texas, and you worked in DC, and you work with people that work in different states and places. Do you think you could speak a little to how you feel that Texas is unique in doing organizing work, or especially faith-based organizing work, than these other places?
Yeah, there are some differences. I mean, California it was our original state project in this work, and of course it's a progressive majority state, so that right away is a different dynamic. I think another difference, Texans certainly think of themselves as more politically diverse. The Jewish Texans I'm talking about in our congregations here, we think of ourselves as more politically diverse, and it probably is true demographically, just based on the numbers. And so I hear that from rabbis a lot. They want to be cautious about what they say in a sermon or how far in front of an issue they get, given that they might get pushback from certain corners politically. And so but that's a dynamic everywhere, to be honest. And so we're always thinking about how you engage that thoughtfully and in a way that doesn't push people out just because they have a different point of view. So that's an interesting challenge that we're always working on. And I think another difference, though, is that we are a small percentage of the Texas population as Jews, and it makes all the more urgent that we do our work in coalition, because we don't have that much power to make change by ourselves. It's also a very strong evangelical Christian state, so that community is very strong. I mean, you see it, I think, the highest profile person who kind of gives voice to that is Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who's very linked into that demographic, that sort of strand of Christianity. And so we're always contending with that. And there's fault lines around support for Israel, which in a certain sense feels stronger among evangelical Christians with a particular vision of what Israel should be. And then on the progressive side, I mean, you see it right now in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests, where sometimes the Israel stuff gets brought up in the background or in the foreground, depending on who you are. Yeah, the previous versions of that platform of some of those groups has had very critical Israel language. So some Jews don't want to talk to them or get involved with them. That has been removed since 3 or 4 years ago, as I understand it. But I think what it really speaks to is the lack of real relationship between the Jewish and Black community, not to mention the lack of awareness that there are Jews of color within our community, but who also get marginalized. So it's very complex, and there's a lot of tension in a lot of different directions. That's not necessarily unique to Texas, but it is something we're seeing here. I also feel like there's different dynamics just city to city in Texas. Houston has a little more of a don't rock the boat vibe, even though it's a very diverse big city. You have a Democratic mayor and county leadership. and it's very pro-business, and people don't like to necessarily bring up contentious issues. That's my experience. You can certainly disagree and find people who disagree. Whereas in Austin, I think it's partly like Austin is just a more outspoken kind of left-leaning city. So you get more of that from the congregations too. And those are, I'll contrast those a lot. And then in San Antonio, it's a different dynamic there too. And I think McAllen is similar, where the congregation has a very high percentage of Jews of Hispanic descent or Latino descent. And that just creates its own set of dynamics. Some of whom have Jewish ancestry, some of whom don't. Maybe they're married to a Jewish person, they converted, whatever, however they found their way in. To my friend who's a rabbi in San Antonio, she does a lot of conversions. And just fascinating dynamic. People are drawn to Judaism. That's wonderful. It's a beautiful thing. And they're bringing them in. And I think they have their own kind of, every synagogue kind of has red lines that the synagogue doesn't want, like certain issues they don't want to talk about. The rabbi has their own red lines about what issues they will or will not address publicly. And then sometimes the dynamic of, I'm not going to give a sermon about that, but let's work on that in this other way. And that's actually something I encourage a lot. It's like a sermon is not the only way to, and sometimes not the best way to make an impact on an issue, especially if it just gets pushback. And it's really like the relationship building, the showing up at meetings, the other kinds of strategy that is more impactful than whether you give a sermon or not. So that's a lot of that's my own learning curve, and also the kind of coaching I do with rabbis.
And while we're here, so obviously you work with immigration. What other kinds of racial justice work do you do with the RAC? And have either you or congregations had any sort of changes since the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing protests that are bringing a lot of like these things to the forefront of people's consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much on everyone's front of mind in my worlds, at least. Our movement has been working on racial justice and racial inclusion for a long time, much longer than this specific incident, but this has certainly galvanized people in a different way. And there's been a strong response, strong demands from us, whether it's at the state level or the national level. What are we doing? How can we act on this? What more can we do? And there's definitely, we have focus on policy, both at the national level and otherwise. And like there are some things Congress is working on, which would be in terms of police reform. That's the particular front of mind issue right now. There's a whole criminal justice approach that's broader than just policing, prisons being the main part of that, but policing may be a first step. But, or not just but, and a lot of that work has to happen also at the city and county level, because that's where a lot of policing decisions get made. So it's probably a combination, needs to be a combination of federal guidelines and mandates and funding, and also pressure on city and county officials, police and sheriff, et cetera, to make changes locally. The other thing we talk about is internally within congregations, that you have to be willing to confront your own biases and ways in which your congregation might not be the most welcoming to people of different backgrounds. And that's racially, but also in every other identity that people bring in the door, or don't bring in the door because they don't feel welcome. And that's a very live congregation. That's one of the things I'm proud of for the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism, that we are putting very much front and center these questions of how are we creating welcoming communities that are truly welcoming and don't just sort of say the right things. And the Department of Audacious Hospitality, which we call it, has just recently put out a congregational inclusion assessment tool where congregations can go through this sort of checklist. It's a first step, maybe at a board level or other leadership team can go through this. And some of it is just to open our own eyes to like, oh, what are the sort of casual things we do without even knowing it that might make a Jew of color feel unwanted, or might make someone with a certain disability not able to be fully involved. So Some of it is just first raising that awareness and then figuring out what kind of internal systemic changes we can make. And it's that idea that you have to get your own house in order if you want to be a good ally out in the world. It's both and always, but it does require sometimes the harder work actually is looking within and saying, how are we getting this wrong that we don't even realize? Where are our blind spots? Sometimes it's easier to like go to a protest and sort of be out there and not confront like how your own behavior is affecting things.
Thank you. That's very thoughtful response. In terms of other ongoing news, it is June of 2020. We're both at home and not meeting in the archives today because of COVID-19. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about how your work has changed in response to COVID. Please. So it's June of 2020, and we're not meeting in the physical archives today because of COVID-19. So I wanted to ask how the current COVID-19 crisis pandemic is changing your work at the RAC, or how you and others are like responding to COVID-19.
It's definitely a weird time, and we're all being pushed and tested in different ways. I already worked remotely, mostly from home, because I'm part of the field team that's in California, Ohio, New York, Illinois, and the DC office as well. So we would meet weekly over Zoom anyway, and I would do a lot of meetings with Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, other places in the state leaders by Zoom, and meet with Houston people locally, and occasionally travel to the other cities to do trainings or meetings. Obviously, I'm not traveling now. One of the upsides has been that congregations have opened up their events to a statewide audience, whereas it normally would have just been their local members. For example, Temple of Bethel in San Antonio did an event on voting rights where they had 3 panelists over. It was all on Zoom, whereas before it would have been in their social hall or sanctuary. And so this way, people from across the state could join the conversation and join the learning. And that's been nice. And I think we will all hopefully take that with us into the next chapter, even when things reopen, that there's a way to stay connected this way. So using that technology even more strategically. That, of course, the challenge is I was alone when I was working at home, and now I have, say, 3 coworkers, my wife and 2 kids. My wife is now sort of taken over the home office because she, being a Cantor, she has a demanding digital presence because she has to stream worship services regularly, and that requires a whole setup of laptop and lighting and microphone and guitar and like table and background. So she has it all worked out, but you know, she needs that space. We're lucky we have a garage apartment, and I'm able to set up here as an alternate space for me. But when school shut down, we have a preschooler and a 2nd grader. That was a big challenge because they had their daily class meetings, which the preschooler mostly didn't want to do, which I understood. And our 2nd grader was actually pretty into, but just like having spaces where everyone can sit and like, but all be on Zoom at the same time, or he was on Microsoft Teams, but using the Wi-Fi. It's definitely chaos. I give the teachers a lot of credit because they were really doing their best in a very difficult situation. And we still don't know what the next school year is going to look like. And we're sitting here in a moment when cases are going up a lot in Texas, and hospitalizations in Houston are going up. ICU beds are full or filling. So that's really nerve-wracking, even as we're in phasing of reopening. So trying to figure all that out. I am actually on a furlough right now as we're talking. I chose a slightly longer one than some of my colleagues just because of the family situation, but we're all being furloughed in some regard. The closing of the Jewish summer camps in our movement meant a massive loss in revenue and furloughing across the board, and some layoffs last month. So it's a really challenging time. And then the question of like, how do you do activism online? Some people have been pretty creative with like drive up protests where they stay in their cars. I did go to the George Floyd march. So I did go to the George Floyd march in Houston, where his family was there. It was, I mean, it was a big deal because he was being brought back to Houston for burial.
Mhm.
And I was there for the opening of the march, and I went beforehand for a clergy gathering as well in the hotel nearby, where people were masked and mostly stayed pretty social distant. Although I will say that 6 feet can very quickly become 3 feet, and then very quickly become too close. It's hard. It's just hard. Um, I left right as the march started because people then were suddenly very packed very closely together, and I was not super comfortable with that part. But it does raise the question about how you do activism and advocacy virtually. The election official meetings that I talked about from last month, all of those were virtual meetings by county, and just ended up someone local got in touch with the election administrator's office, set up a Zoom meeting. I joined as well.
Okay.
So starting about the march here in Houston. So I did go to the George Floyd march in Houston. Partly there was an invitation to clergy to come to a gathering beforehand in the hotel nearby the march near Discovery Green. And there was a moment of prayer and reflection and some inspiring remarks about how to continue the work together. And we were all wearing masks there. And they gave out shirts that said, "Let my people go now." And we all wore those. And then went out to Discovery Green. I stayed for the opening remarks, and I was struck by the speaker at the beginning who very specifically said, "This is a peaceful protest. We're here to honor George's memory and push for change, but we're here to be peaceful. And if y'all see anyone out there who is trying to instigate violence, you point them out, because that's not what we're here. They're threatening the integrity of what we're doing here." So that felt good to hear. Then when the march itself started, people were suddenly packed together on Discovery Green and then through the streets of downtown. And I had planned to not stay the whole time anyway, so I left at that point. But like you said, the challenge of doing advocacy and organizing in this time, how do you do that virtually? The county election meetings we've been doing that I mentioned that we did last month, they were all virtual. We reached out to county election officials and set up those meetings on Zoom. And I joined with the cluster of leaders from the county involved just to kind of help take notes and help guide some of the questions. But that's just how we're all doing business right now.
Yep. That's just how it is. I'm glad the work can continue in whatever form. With that, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for doing this. Excited to be a part of the archive. I may also have some physical records of interest from the time when my grandparents were teaching Hebrew in Houston, or so I'll be in touch about that. But
okay.
Also glad we captured the like disruption of trying to do internet interviews in this time, all the disconnection and freezing and all that comes with that. But
Yep. It's good.
thanks for bearing with me.
Yes. Thank you as well.